An Arab solves a puzzle. The Arabs of the Fayyum had thought that papyrus was worthless, for many of them gathered the ancient paper from the ruins and used it for fuel. As the years passed, the local people began to see how eager the foreigners were to find papyrus. Surely, the Arabs thought, it must be valuable. No one would work in the blistering desert heat merely for pleasure. As papyrus became scarce, the Arabs began excavating in the ruins of the Fayyum, collecting the precious paper for themselves. They sold it for a high price to dealers from Cairo, who resold it to the foreigners who came to the market. The hot, narrow streets of Cairo, where merchants sold their wares, were crowded with sellers and buyers. Here a person could buy articles of silver or gold, fine silks, precious gems, a Greek spearhead, or a yellow melon. The townspeople in long, loose robes bartered and haggled with the shopkeepers. Some gossiped more than they bartered. The silversmith's hammer tinkled, and the stone cutter's wheel whined above the shouting of the vendors. Donkeys, heavily loaded, stumbled from street to street. The air smelled of spice, fruit, and ancient dust. One spring morning in 1931, Chester Beatty, a London merchant, pushed his way through the crowd looking for someone. In his eagerness, he nearly upset a large basket of dried figs. The seller of figs shouted, waving a stick, but the merchant hurried on. He paused at the entrance to a small shop and leaned against the stucco wall. He drew his hands across his forehead to wipe away the perspiration. A drink, sir, the voice behind him was inviting. He turned quickly. Abu, he said. The Arab, grinning from ear to ear, took the hand stretched out to him. For 2 days I have been in the marketplace, Abu, searching for your brother Khalid. His shop has been closed and I was about to give up. The merchant and the Arab walked over to a refreshment stand where Abu ordered a fruit drink. Mr. Beatty, you are still buying papyrus from my brother, Abu said. We had an appointment 2 days ago, said Beatty. He told me in a letter that he had some well-preserved sheets of papyrus that would interest me, but I can't find him. Do you know where he is? My boat sails day after tomorrow. You foreigners are all alike, always going somewhere and always in a hurry to get there. Beatty smiled at the gentle rebuke. I have something to tell you, the Arab continued as he drew closer to the merchant. He lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. Khalid returned from the Fayyum early this morning. He and some other Arabs have found several jars filled with papyrus in an old cemetery. Khalid believes it to be part of an ancient Christian library. Beatty was startled by the information and set his glass on the counter. Tell me where I can find Khalid. He is meeting in secret with some Arab dealers to decide what should be done with their treasure. You cannot see him before tomorrow morning when he will be in his shop. The next day, Beatty arose from before dawn and reached the bazaar as the rays of the sun struck the minarets of the Muhammad Ali Mosque. Worshippers were streaming from the mosque into the marketplace where vegetable vendors were shouting their wares. Beatty stepped into the familiar corridor and waited by one of the shop entrances. Above the door, a sign read, Antiques, Khalid Baba, proprietor. He glanced at his watch, for he was not sure how long he would have to wait. Long ago, he had learned that an Arab does not hurry. Most of the shops were already busy when Khalid arrived, carrying a neat bundle under his arm. He greeted Beatty with pleasure. I have good news for you, he said. Abu has told me of your discovery in the Fayyum. Then you know, Khalid smiled. Come into the shop before any customers arrive. I want to show you what we have found. Khalid laid the bundle on the table and gently removed the outer covering. Beatty counted 10 sheets of papyrus. He took a magnifying glass from his coat and began to make careful inspection of them. Abul said that you found them in jars in a cemetery, said Beatty, continuing his inspection. We think they are part of an early Christian library, the dealer said, as he lighted an incense burner and tidied up the counter. What makes you think that? Khalid did not answer. He moved toward the corner of the room and began arranging some antique pottery on a shelf. Beatty, bending over the papyrus, began to speak softly as he turned the pages. Romans, Corinthians, Ephesians. His voice was filled with excitement as he spoke aloud. This is truly an amazing find. He straightened up and looked toward Khalid. The dealer did not turn but continued his work. These sheets are a copy of some of the writings of St. Paul. What will this mean? The magnifying glass was trembling in Beatty's hand. Khalid, what do you make of this? Still there was no response from the corner. Beatty laid the magnifying glass on the table and stared at the dealer. Khalid, the Arab turned. Where are the remaining sheets of the manuscript? You have here only a few pages of these books. Where are the rest of the sheets? The merchant sat on the edge of the table awaiting a reply. Aren't you satisfied with these, Mr. Beatty? You seem suspicious. Surely you wouldn't accuse me of... I'm not accusing anyone, the merchant interrupted. I've been buying papyrus long enough to know that dealers can be crafty. The Arab looked hurt. You don't trust me? Have you forgotten the incident a year ago in this very bazaar? Began the merchant. Remember those two sly dealers who divided a complete manuscript into several parts and then sold each part separately for outrageous prices? You know what the government did with them. Khalid looked toward the floor. It was unfortunate, he said at length, but Khalid is honest. The Arab looked pleadingly at the merchant. As yet, I have no reason not to trust you. I will be expecting you to obtain the remaining sheet of St. Paul's letters. Beatty took one of the sheets to the doorway and held it up to the light to inspect it more closely. And if I should find them, Khalid spoke hesitantly. Send a telegram to my London office. I sail tomorrow from Alexandria, the merchant said. And the price? Do you wish to make an offer? I have always paid a fair price. Beatty returned to the table and wrapped the papyrus in the cloth. He paid for the 10 sheets and left the shop. A large white steamer carrying the English flag pulled slowly away from the pier as the passengers lined the rail for a last look at the land of the pharaohs. Chester Beatty was among them. As a crowd milled about on the wharf, a turbaned Arab suddenly appeared, waving frantically and calling, Mr. Beatty, Mr. Beatty. The merchant recognized the voice of Khalid. What do you want? Beatty shouted. The noise made conversation difficult. I think I can get the rest of the papyrus for you, said Khalid, his hands cupped around his mouth as he shouted. Beatty smiled. Good, he shouted. I knew you would. There will be a price, Khalid called at the top of his voice. A blast of the ship's whistle drowned out the rest of his words. The distance between the boat and the dock grew wider. A lad standing next to Mr. Beatty turned toward him. What was that man in the turban yelling about? The merchant looked down at the questioning face. Oh, just a small business matter. Beatty tried to hide a frown as he looked again toward the pier. Looks like bad luck, mister, the boy insisted. I guess he came too late. That depends, Beatty said. Yesterday I bought 10 sheets of valuable papyrus from the man you saw on the pier. Do you call that bad luck? Papyrus? You mean that real ancient paper? I saw some once in a museum. Beatty smiled. Would you like to touch some of it? The boy's face lighted up. Would I? When? I will be glad to see you in my stateroom this evening. Early that evening, Chester Beatty answered the boy's knock on his door. I came to see that papyrus, the lad said. I brought my father. You don't mind, do you? Certainly not. Come in. I'm Dr. Forrest from London, the boy's father said, by way of introduction. When they were seated, the merchant took the sheets of papyrus from the drawer and related the story behind them. Then actually the desert sand was God's way of burying this waste paper to preserve it through the centuries, exclaimed the London physician. Do you see how well this piece has been preserved? Beatty said. This is a copy of a part of Paul's letter to the Romans. The physician examined the Greek manuscript and passed it to his son. The boy took it with great care. Smells old, doesn't it? Do you think that this manuscript agrees with the teachings of Paul as found in the King James Version? Asked the physician. Every biblical manuscript that has been found agrees with the truths of our Bible, Chester Beatty replied. How old do you think these sheets are? I'm not an authority in dating old writings, but I would say they were copied about 500 or 600 years after the death of Christ. Remarkable, Dr. Force exclaimed. They are nearly as old as the famous Bible discovered by Tischendorf at Sinai. It is a tragedy that you do not have all of it. Beatty placed the musty sheets in the drawer. He turned to his guests. I fear I shall never see them, he said. When Chester Beatty returned to England, he showed the papyrus sheets to Dr. Frederick Kenyon, a well-known English archaeologist, and to other scholars. After study and comparison, they dated the Chester Beatty papyri, as they were called, at the beginning of the 3rd century. This was 100 years earlier than the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus manuscripts. One day, Dr. Kenyon called on Beatty. I know you have been anxious to find the last sheets of the books of St. Paul. Today I received a cablegram from the University of Michigan in America. It has just acquired 30 sheets of this manuscript. Chester Beatty immediately wired the university and learned that the message was correct, but 46 sheets of the manuscript were still in Egypt, waiting for someone to buy them. Beatty returned to Egypt, and there he met Khalid, who for a good price sold the rest of the manuscript to the Englishman. As Beatty sat and looked out over the blue expanse of the Mediterranean from the deck of the ship sailing for England, he mused. We have letters of Paul copied within 150 years after his death. Has God preserved somewhere in this world the letters which Paul wrote and dictated? If so, will they ever be revealed?